Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, User and Policy Needs of Biodiversity Data in Europe. Since we only have 1 hour, we will start right on time, even though participants are still joining. I will stop the screen sharing for a moment so that we might be able to see each other. My name is Hannah Mörsberger. I am one of the lead authors of the assessment, and I work for the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, IDIF, in Germany. We're very excited to hold this webinar. We have 130 registered participants from 32 countries, all across Europe and a bit of outside Europe. So that's really exciting, and it actually reflects the wide stakeholder participation that we had in this user and policy needs assessment. Just a few very brief housekeeping rules. I think at this point, it's almost not worth mentioning them anymore, but just to be on the safe side, of course, please mute yourselves during the presentations. Of course, you can also switch off your video during the presentations. For the second half of this webinar, we have scheduled an interactive discussion space where you can ask all the questions to the authors. During that time, we invite everyone to switch on their videos, but until then, yeah, do as you wish. And yeah, with that, I will already hand over our virtual microphone to Stefan Leiner, who will give a few brief words of welcome. Stefan Leiner is the head of the Natural Capital and Ecosystem Health Unit in the European Commission's Directorate General of Environment, DG Environment. We are very, very happy to have him here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words introducing this important event. I would start by recalling what Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, said as part of in her Green Deal paper. And she said, one cannot manage what one cannot measure. And also in that spirit, one of the pillars of the new European Green Deal, the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, is calling for a policy monitoring and review mechanism to support the implementation and track progress on whether the actions are delivering the desired outcomes. And this is also important when we are implementing existing legislation and also upcoming legislation like a nature restoration law that we are preparing at the moment. So this is why the Commission and DG Environment, as a user also of EuropaBON, we have high expectations and expect a cost-effective and sound science-based proposal by 2023 for an operational EU biodiversity observation network that addresses as much as possible the EU policy needs. So it should be a EU-wide monitoring observation network integrating existing data streams like citizen science observations, remote sensing, long-term ecological research, filling remaining data gaps, and overcoming also important workflow bottlenecks, for example, raw data access or the lack of harmonized methodologies to effectively inform environment policy and management. So obviously this is in a context where we are not only losing biodiversity itself, but we are also losing the expertise in biodiversity. Taxonomists and other specialists who are needed for the monitoring are becoming fewer and fewer, and we need strategies to motivate people to become engaged and to provide long-term career perspectives for those scientists and observers. So on top of that, we need to join forces with other ongoing activities. EuropaBON is not on an island, but it's really in the context of many ongoing activities in the context of the biodiversity strategy. For example, the new partnership, Biodiversa Plus, It's the new European co-funded biodiversity partnership jointly developed by Biodiversa and the European Commission, particularly DG's Research and Innovation and DG Environment, where I work. And that Biodiversity Plus partnership started on the 1st of October 2021, and it will set up a transnational network of harmonized schemes to improve monitoring of biodiversity and ecosystem services across Europe, inter alia. It has, of course, also a lot of other different tasks. So this work should build on the work of existing national regional monitoring schemes and initiatives, such as the mass process mapping and assessing ecosystem and their services, EuropaBON, for example, and we really need to make sure that this cooperation will effectively happen, and obviously EuropaBON will be an important player in that context. So what we need is a functional and operational proposal. The approach, for example, that we use for designing the pollinator network under our Pollinators initiative, I think is an example to be profiled and can be followed also, as it delivered a very concrete costed proposal that allows to monitor changes in pollinator. And we are now testing and with a plan to really outroll it throughout the EU. Also in the context of the nature restoration law, there should be obligations on improving pollinator populations. So monitoring progress is really important here. So I will finish by saying that the next steps for me is the challenge ahead is quite huge, but there is no other way than agreeing collectively on a long-term perspective for a robust science-based policy, science-based biodiversity observation network. And we look forward for a stepwise modular approach that can be developed, tested, and then expanded over the years. And it is by involving a wide range of users, policymakers, managers, scientists, government organizations, NGOs, citizen scientists, and the private sector that EuropaBON provides a key platform for making it happen. And this event is very important in that context. So I wish you a very successful event. I look forward to the presentations and to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your warm words of welcome and for laying out the wider context as well as the Commission's expectations to EuropaBON. We take it as a compliment to our competencies that the pressure is on. So we thought that not everyone here might be familiar with EuropaBON, the project itself. So we have scheduled a very brief presentation, an overview of what EuropaBON is. It will be given by Henrique Pereira, who is the principal investigator of the project and who is also the head of the Biodiversity Conservation Research Group at IDEF, at the German Center of Integrative Biodiversity Research. So over to you, Henrique.
Thank you, Anna. And also I want to thank Mr. Leinert for this very nice introduction on behalf of the Commission, and for indeed raising the bar for us. So next slide, please. Okay, so the problem that was already summarized by Mr. Leinert is that biodiversity monitoring data is still very sparse in time and space and covers only some taxa. The most recent State of Nature assessment in the EU from 2019 had a revealing paragraph where it says a noteworthy portion of the reporting information comes from expert opinion and partial surveys, indicating the absence or incomplete monitoring schemes in member states. So this is, let's say, the state of the art regarding reporting for the birds and the habitats, for the Birds and the Habitats Directive. This is further complicated because biodiversity change has complex spatial patterns and temporal dynamics. We have learned a lot about these complexities of biodiversity change over the last decade. And because there is limited resources for monitoring. There's limited resources for conservation, limited resources for monitoring. And in some studies suggest that monitoring already takes up 50% of conservation budgets, what is probably arguably too high already, if that's the case. So next slide. So the Commission put up this call on the Horizon 2020 program on monitoring ecosystems through research, innovation, and technology, and stated the challenges harnessing scientific advances and bringing together various actors to devise a cost-effective approach to monitoring, combining multiple data streams, and the action ultimately should design a EU-wide framework for monitoring biodiversity ecosystem services. And that's what we are doing with the EuropaBON. EuropaBON was the winner of this call. Can you go to the next slide? And so in EuropaBON, we have 5 work packages. They are all centered in stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement has been the core principle of our work. It underpins all the work that we have been doing. And today we're going to hear about the first major deliverable of the project, that is exactly the user needs assessment report, where we have tried to identify the landscape across stakeholders in Europe of user needs regarding biodiversity monitoring. We have another work package on assessing existing biodiversity monitoring schemes, another work package on designing, in reality, co-designing with the stakeholders, the future framework for biodiversity monitoring, and a work package on policy showcase, where I'm illustrating the approach that we are following in EuropaBON to design this monitoring system for particular showcases, for particular examples of how it could be applied in regarding the Birds Directive, Habitats Directive, among others. And the approach is really this idea that we can integrate different data streams through models, and that we can produce essential biodiversity variables to describe the state of biodiversity that can then be used for indicators, for assessment, for scenarios. Next slide. So the consortium of EuropaBON is composed by 15 partners with different expertises and covering several countries across the European Union. But this is not only let's say the participants in this endeavor. In reality, we are also, as part of our stakeholder engagement, running a members network of EuropaBON, and we already have over 700 members registered. Anyone can go into this website at europabon.org and become a member and receive information about the development of the project, and also contribute to the different tasks that we are developing the biodiversity framework monitoring for Europe. Next slide, please. And a bit more on essential biodiversity variables. This is an approach that has been really promoted by GeoBON, by the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network. That is to identify the key aspects of biodiversity that need to be monitored across sites, and then identify what kind of data sources we have, how can we aggregate them using biodiversity informatics, how can we combine them with remote sensing, and how can we use models to fill many of the spatial and temporal gaps to produce this kind of EBV cubes for the different variables, where you have contiguous information in space and time, and also across biological entities, and making that information publicly available for users, and in ways that we can use this information across scales. Next slide. So the work plan of EuropaBON has a few key deliverables. Today we're going to hear about the deliverable on the user needs assessment that took about a year to finalize. We have just also published a database that is still being completed, but on inventory of monitoring initiatives. I'll show you the how you can contribute to that or consult that in a moment. In a couple of months, we are going to publish the list of essential variables that should be monitored. The next, we'll identify gaps on monitoring DCBVs in existing monitoring schemes, and we'll design novel monitoring schemes to fulfill these gaps and demonstrate the approach of the essential biodiversity variables in a data portal. The final deliverable will be terms of reference for the establishment of a European level biodiversity monitoring coordination center to implement this biodiversity monitoring system. Next slide. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that you can check publications, all the publications and deliverables of EuropaBON in a Rio collection at this DOI, or if you just search for or Google for Rio and EuropaBON, you'll find this collection of all the deliverables, the project proposal. You can also find us in EuropaBON.org and also use the links there or at Twitter. And finally, if you want to go to the database that we are already collecting of biodiversity monitoring initiatives, you want to go to monitoring.europabon.org and check on that database. So thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed today's presentation on the user needs assessment.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for this overview of the EuropaBON project. We will jump right next to the next presentation. If any of you have any questions, I either keep them for the discussion time we have right after the next presentation, or type them in the chat box, please. Okay, so now we will go to the centerpiece of this webinar, which is the presentation of the user and policy needs assessment. It will be presented by Aletta Bonn, who is the head of the Ecosystem Services Research Group at IDIV, and she's also affiliated with the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and FSC Jena. And by Ian McCallum, who is the lead of Novel Data Ecosystems for Sustainability Research Group at IIASA, the institute, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. Welcome, Aletta. Welcome, Ian. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you very much. You can go straight away to the next slide. And I'd like to thank especially you, Hannah, as well as Juliette Martin, Jesse Juncker and Evelina Georgieva, because you've done the heavy lifting of this report, together with many of you who contributed to the report and where this is really a joint effort. So I'm very glad, and this maybe also shows the spirit, as Henrike said, of EuropaBON. We actually started with a stakeholder assessment. Usually you start with these things that you think about the different biodiversity aspects of spatial, temporal driver, and then drivers and how you can connect this. But here it is important to us that here we live in a landscape in Europe where a lot is happening already, but it's fragmented, and it needs to what we want to do with EuropaBON to develop something which is useful, user-friendly and policy relevant, and also so that it will help us to implement the policies. Okay, next slide. And therefore we developed quite a long process or an intensive process where we started with a public stakeholder workshop where many of you probably were listening, were there with representing 170 representatives from over 170 organizations and almost 50 countries. Then there were a lot of input because it was a hands-on workshop and conference, where we then developed a survey to work with the biodiversity representatives of 21 countries and 4 EC services. Overall, it was actually 10 EC services who participated, European Commission services. This then, to complement that survey, we conducted semi-structured interviews, which then led to an expert meeting, which was great, in September last year. And that then had several iterations of the first draft. with an open review process where many contributed and actually enhanced the report very much, so that the user policy report could then be launched. Okay, yeah. So there was a wide participation of countries across Europe, and in total over 10 European Commission services participated and also facilitated this. We are also very grateful to the European Commission for facilitating this. Here you can see a graphic version, so who participated in the public workshop, the interviews, survey and expert meetings. Okay. And we're very grateful for the time and expertise that was offered in the input to this. So the executives, the content of the report is obviously first an executive summary, which I hope you could all have a look at, the introduction, but then also what are the actual biodiversity data use and uptake in policy making, and where is it needed, then the challenges and solutions to biodiversity monitoring, and then how we can move towards the using these solutions towards the design of a European biodiversity monitoring system. And then obviously conclusion and outlook. This will also be the structure of this report, of this talk, which we try to keep short, and we hope you have all access to the digital report. Okay, next slide. So when we looked at what are actually current biodiversity monitoring efforts, and I would like to say there is a second workshop work package which is going to go into more detail. So we will, you will have an in-depth overview of this also in the following EuropaBON workshop. But where we could see that most of the majority of the biodiversity monitoring, which is currently being done in the EU by the different member states, is focusing a lot on birds, obviously then mammals, insects, although it's the largest group, is only a few parts, and you can see that there is more devoted to plants and fungi, but it mainly feeds into the Habitats Directive and into the Birds Directive. And strangely, a lot of this, or maybe not strangely, a lot of this information is not being used by a neighboring directive like the Water Framework Directive, agricultural policies, actually very little of this, and others, and climate policies, although these should be forming this. And maybe this is already showing a need that the available information is at the moment not being used by these policies. And maybe it is, so there could be one of the things could be that it's either not being used, or secondly that it's not being used, that it's not useful, that it's not presented in a format so that it can be easily incorporated. It's probably both of this. Okay, next one. And so the relevance and uptake of monitoring of data by policy and practice is that 50% of the schemes actually are currently used to inform conservation actions at the species and protected area levels, which obviously most of our biodiversity legislation and regulations are being written for. So what you can see on the left-hand side, it's been used for species management plans, to assess species conservation stages and action plans, as well as protected area management and designation. Has been less been used, for example, for other plants, and for example, to assess also ecosystem state and ecosystem services, where however much of this information could be used, or where additional information indicators need to be implemented into regular monitoring so that these could be assessed. Next slide. So as you can guess, most of the monitoring schemes obviously focus on species and record for species management and action with a taxonomic focus on birds. Next slide. And this then outlines also some of the challenges and roadblocks in biodiversity monitoring. So one of the challenges, and which is a true challenge, is obviously always financial resource constraints. But we're very glad that we're working with the European Commission together on this, and that there is a strong wish to develop a European-wide biodiversity monitoring with EuropaBON and other initiatives. But one of the things which lies behind this is actually that there's a lack of long-term policies for monitoring. And if that isn't given, then it's very difficult to also allocate finances for this. Currently, we see quite scattered and insufficient spatial coverage, with some countries doing already very well, others not doing so well, very often because of capacity issues. Some taxa are underrepresented. It is astonishing that insects, for example, are monitored very little, although they form the biggest taxa, but we already heard that pollination in monitoring is underway. And next to the financial resources, there is a lack of human and technical capacities, and that member states, and especially some, are especially stretched in order to develop this, and that there is a great will to do this, but very often there is a lack of capacities, and this needs to be boosted. On the other hand, sometimes this is also not very well integrated. So, for example, in situ monitoring and remote sensing data could be much better integrated, but also the different activities between the countries could be better integrated and could share then resources. Sometimes it was felt that the monitoring data frequency is too low to detect actually trends. So if this is too low, then actually the data are not being useful. But there is also, and I think I said this before, a lack of data integration across different geographical scales, and here EuropaBON can help. Most importantly, however, very often only aggregated data are being reported. This then diminishes actually their information content, and there is a lack of raw accessible data or accessible raw data and fair data. And if a lot of the actual information detail is being lost when it's been reported to the European Commission or at the European level, this was maybe at the start of when this was started. This was due to server capacities and that it needed to be condensed. But I think we now have technical capacities that this is not that we can actually now report also raw data, which would make it much easier to actually detect trends and drivers. And then obviously there's an underrepresentation not only of taxa, but also certain ecosystem types. And we have to be reminded that the marine ecosystems also need to be included, and as well as freshwater systems. And we very often talk about terrestrial data. Well, there are a lot of initiatives on the way. Okay, next slide. So the challenges and roadblocks obviously differ between different parts of Europe: Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. And if we group them, if you click on, we can see that on the one hand, there is sort of the natural science challenges. So monitoring frequency too low, underrepresentation of ecosystem types, and so on, insufficient spatial coverage. But then there is another term that was the next one. If you click the next one, obviously the lack of long-term policies, which affected especially Southern Europe, as well as parts of Western Europe. But others were actually Eastern Europe didn't think that this was a case. Financial resource constraint was for everyone, but lack of human and technical capacities was differing. And then lastly, for many was that there was a lack of integration. I think we can cover this, and I hope that with EuropaBON we can come to some solutions. So I'm moving to those in the next slide. So potential solutions actually can be 5 different ones, which in the next slide I'm going to explain in more detail. But these are linked to 3 really implementation initiatives of the European Commission. So enhanced coordination efforts via IONET, supported by newly established data sharing standards. Then secondly, capacity building used to enhance modeling and techniques in countries in need of training. And then lastly, the European Commission to establish a EU-wide monitoring fund to subsidize funding programs. And these, so there are 5 solutions which where these could where we can group those challenges. If you go to the next slide. On the one hand, first of all, enhance coordination cooperation, because there's a lot of expertise across the member states and across practice, policy, and science. Many of you are involved in this. But then we need a standardization and enhanced data gathering and sharing, where we can use different techniques, both for modeling as well as novel technologies. There is an EuropaBON workshop in May. It's still open. Please do register for this if you want to participate with your expertise or just to listen in. then we do need financial resources for doing this, and obviously it needs capacity building and stakeholder engagement. Some of this is already happening, and we're very grateful for all the expertise which is being integrated in EuropaBON. Please do sign up if you want to join. And in more detail, if we look at these 5 solutions, we have to see that we, first of all, overall coordination cooperation obviously involves a synchronization of monitoring efforts to synthesize the fragmented data landscape. There is a lot of data out there, but it's highly fragmented, and here we need to synchronize this. Also with coordinated monitoring programs and also some new programs. A lot of the member states actually we need guidance of identifying the monitoring priorities. So if you have only a few resources, we do need guidance of where the priorities and authoritative standardized monitoring protocols. This will obviously mean that we can have standardized protocols which link also to the ongoing activities and a better synchronization of data collection across countries. Here again, reporting obligations need to provide clearly defined indicators for each policy target so that they can actually implement this. And this was wished by all countries, and a European coordination platform. Next slide. So with enhanced standardization of data and data gathering, we obviously want to have dedicated data sharing mechanisms which apply the FAIR principles, so the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable principles. I already said that if we have more open, free data, this will be used by the many scientists as well as agencies to actually analyze these results and to come up. And here we can use new statistical tools for heterogeneous data. It's now possible to combine, for example, citizen science data, which form actually a bulk of the data, with other standardized monitoring. We are coming to EBVs and ESVs in parts of the next slides. And we need to create public databases and reliable data infrastructures, which are being formed to make these data easily accessible to both researchers and policymakers so that they can actually use or inform the policy needs. Here we can use increased modeling efforts and the use of new technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, remote sensing, 24/7 monitoring, meta-barcoding and eDNA. And as I said, there will be a special workshop on this. Please do sign on so that we can address both the monitoring design methods and data analysis. And some of this is being already mainstreamed. Some of this is on the horizon. And here EuropaBON wants to provide guidance how we can integrate this with also classical monitoring. Next slide. I will rush a little bit through this. So obviously it does need adequate substantial financial resources, both at the integration, but also at the member states. And we would like to also have capacity building by developing what we're already doing, a skills and knowledge network through a virtual platform of experts and stakeholders. And we thank you all for joining in. This can hopefully also develop cross-training of experts across all disciplines, modernize IONET, and embrace citizen science, where we do know that 70 to 80% of the data of biodiversity data is being collected by volunteers across Europe, so that we can use this expertise to develop not only solutions, but also joint monitoring. Okay, I pass over here to Ian.
Great. Thank you very much, Aletta. Yes, and warm welcome also to everyone from my side. A big thanks also to the team that worked very hard on the report, and to all the stakeholders who contributed. And many of you are actually on the call today. We had some 400 comments on an earlier draft of this document, which we worked through. So really appreciate all of the effort. And so it really was a community effort, the report. Great. So I will just continue here with chapter 4 of the report, the final chapter, which was titled Towards the Design of a European Biodiversity Monitoring System. And initially here you see 2 clusters of user and policy needs, which were identified to be of key importance in Europe over the next 5 to 10 years. On the left-hand side, actually the integrated cross-sectoral policies, which are in need of improved biodiversity monitoring, and these are some of them, but there are certainly many more. ranging from the EU Biodiversity Strategy to the Water Framework Directive to nature directives. And if we unpack on the right-hand side the EU Biodiversity Strategy, then we see within there specific needs in terms of restoration, protected areas, ecosystem services, and so forth. So a variety of different policy needs that have been identified. And as was alluded to earlier in the presentation, also there are certainly is already some low-hanging fruit here that we've been able to identify within the effort of producing this report, where some of these policies could already are collecting some data, and it could potentially be shared and useful for other policies, perhaps just simply by being repackaged and reworked, or even simply just being made available. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah. So one of the main efforts that we were focusing on also in this exercise actually was the identification of these essential biodiversity and ecosystem service variables, which Enrique was speaking about earlier on. So looking in particular at what kind of variables and data are needed to address those policy questions for the different frameworks in Europe. So initially we came up with a listing here together with various stakeholders of about 45 essential EBVs, and we went also through sort of a ranking process of this, coming up with an absolute ranking. But this is again just sort of a temporary. This work is in progress, so this is not a definitive list. Actually, just last week we had a very targeted expert workshop focusing on the EBVs, and as Enrique was mentioning, in the next weeks or a few months, we will be coming out with a more definitive list of EBVs. It's grown since this effort here. Next slide, please. So looking then now just in a little bit more detail at the top 15 from this previous list, which were ranked. Just as a bit of an example across Europe here, you see some of the issues that I think we're all aware of, but this just quantifies them a little bit more clearly. You see a majority of these EBVs are related to species abundance and species distributions. They are ranging, so including also freshwater and marine ecosystems, but typically also a lot focused on birds and habitats as well. But you see, looking across Europe, that in many cases, for most countries, there's a few countries where we don't have information still at this point, but for most countries, a lot of the EBVs that we would require are not sufficiently monitored. They are perhaps being monitored, but not at a sufficient level, perhaps not temporal or meeting the temporal or spatial needs. A few countries are a bit farther ahead. And as I mentioned, some we were not able to collect enough data on, but there's certainly a lot of gaps here that we need to address. Some countries have been are just sort of in the process of launching national monitoring systems, so that's a really good sign. But certainly, EuropaBON is really looking to address this issue that one sees here about the insufficiency of the monitoring. Next slide, please. Great. So looking here again at these same 15 ranked, highly ranked EBVs that are addressing these policy questions here. So in the middle, we see the policy questions which the EBVs can address. And what you notice here is that one EBV can potentially address multiple policy questions in many cases. And similarly, one policy question requires this information from a variety of different EVBs. So it's really about putting these things together. And so we're also in the process of trying to unpack this and analyze it a bit further to understand where here perhaps are low-hanging fruit. Where one can really rather quickly address some of these policy needs. Others will perhaps require more effort and more funding. So there's also an effort going on right now on cost-benefit analysis of all this work. And then we've pulled it together on the far right here, just looking at the major EU policy missions and how these various policy questions come into putting biodiversity on the fast track to recovery, looking at ensuring ecosystems continue to deliver other ecosystem services, and also on the very important topic of restoration. The next slide, please. Yeah, and this is my final slide. I think just looking a little bit at the road ahead. So now we've completed this this user and needs assessment, identifying the data needs for these various policy questions. We're now in the process of assessing the existing monitoring schemes, looking at which of the open policy questions can be addressed with existing data. So this would obviously, in terms of cost benefit, would be highly advantageous to do that. And similarly, we're undergoing this process right now on how the EBVs can help to fill the data gaps. And one of the topics there being the novel technologies, as was mentioned, and also cost effectiveness. So I think I will conclude there and hand it back to you, Hannah, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian and Aletta. I just stopped sharing my screen because, yeah, after this very dense, very rich presentation, and I think Aletta and Ian did a great job trying to squeeze it into 20 minutes, even though it is a 60-page report. We invite you to ask all the questions that you might have on the results, on the process, on the outlook, on next steps, anything that yeah, you would like to ask. If you would like to ask your question directly, please just raise your hand and you will be able to speak up and we'll be able to discuss. Otherwise, if you might have a less confident day today, so then you can also type it in the chat box and we will pick it up from there. Miriam, I see that you have.
Yeah, let me just take the floor. So my name is Miriam Hoyet. I'm in France at the National Agricultural Research Institute. I'm involved a little bit in initiatives about genetic diversity, and I was wondering, where is the genetics in your monitoring framework, knowing that the global biodiversity framework for after 2020 is still in negotiation, and that genetic diversity is extremely important for the adaptation of plants and animals and any organism to a changing environment. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Aletta, maybe you want to take this.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. Thank you very much. I was first of all thinking about whether you were thinking about novel technologies, sort of using genetics in order to monitor, but it's about the genetic diversity, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can be DNA data, but often you have proxies on existing data, such as census data, distribution data, that can be good proxies to estimate genetic diversity, because what we are interested in is the diversity within species.
That's right, that's right. So it was mentioned also as one of the important points, but it didn't make it to the top ones. So thanks for bringing it up again, and then also keeping it so that we do need also genetic diversity. It was mentioned, but it wasn't sort of listed among the top ones. Yeah, but obviously genetic diversity is also included in EBVs. The main thing is then always how do you manage this, and what you also already just said is how can we use proxies, how can we use data which is already being collected to also assess this, because biodiversity is obviously not just species diversity, as you say. Yeah,
there are actually genetic indicators that are making it through the Global Biodiversity Network paper and framework, sorry. So I think there's good potential.
Thank you, thank you. Hannah, do you want to moderate, or otherwise Christos is the next one?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christos Arvantidis from Library. This report makes a landmark here. It was missing actually from the picture, and I see that it will be, highly cited by many users actually. And all I have to say, is congratulations to the EuropaBON network, its operators, and the huge network of the experts that they have engaged in their activities. That's very important. That's the way, forward. I brought in the previous event the issue of the genetic diversity, like Miriam. So I'm not going to bring it again. One little thing that I would like, to state here is that sometimes probably the way we communicate, some of the messages is not, the right one from the political point of view. And from the point of view of the implementers. I heard, many times that this EBV addresses this policy, this EBV addresses that policy. Whatever we do and whatever, research products we support, we develop, they do not address directly some kind of policy. They are used, I guess, in combination and many times. And what we offer to address the policies is actually knowledge, and that knowledge is knowledge about the what if questions, which can be used directly, and therefore it can addresses the questions and the priorities of the policies. Just a small statement on this, and that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah, Christos. Yeah, that's yeah, a very good point. Yeah, well noted, and appreciate the comment on the report. Thank you. Maybe we'll hand over to Isabel.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for preparing this seminar. It was really good. I'm from University of Minho in Portugal, and I work mostly with freshwater fungi, and that's one of the topics that I was seeing on your EBV's list. There is no reference to fungi or freshwater fungi whatsoever. So, and I know, of course, that conservation of fungi is not on the super hot topics, and freshwater fungi at all, it doesn't exist. But I wanted to ask if there is any predictions in the future to try to include also freshwater fungi or fungi in the lists. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Maybe we can ask Enrique, just based on the workshop last week.
Yeah, I think I'm afraid Enrique had to leave.
Okay.
But sorry. Yeah, Jessie.
Yeah, it's me, Jessie. Sorry. Yeah, I think Enrique had to leave. Maybe I can answer this question. So it's I mean, it's an ongoing process. I think it's really good that you bring this up, and we had this workshop last week Friday where we try to expand or refine the list that we came up with during this user and policy needs assessment, and the process is not finished yet, because now we have, with the experts that were invited to the workshop, added EBVs, but we're going to do a follow-up survey, and all these suggestions, I'm noting them down and I'm adding them, and then we can prioritize EBVs at a later stage, because obviously if it's too many, you know, we have to prioritize, because we cannot monitor all of them immediately with the new system that we're going to design. So, but I have taken note of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe over to Tim. I see your hand up. Thanks, Tim.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I also give my own congratulations to this very comprehensive user needs report. It's a really fantastic piece of work. I think that from our point of view, something which will be really critical as EuropaBON goes forward is that, having identified those needs and some of the perceived shortcomings in the ability to meet them, it's always important not to overlook the existing tools and processes that are available and people are maybe not using to their best advantage, in order to be able to provide that raw data flow and to make it accessible. And of course, you'd expect me to say, don't overlook the tools that the GBIF has already developed. But I would also just add, understanding that there are limitations to the way in which the existing simplified data model that GBIF uses can adequately deal with and fairly represent the richness of ecological monitoring. I would just direct people, and I have done in the chat, to a current, from our point of view, really critical consultation that's now going on to have a thorough review of that data model with a view to enriching and diversifying the way in which data can be shared through GBIF to better deal with the needs, especially of ecological monitoring networks. And it's almost a once in a generation opportunity to have that kind of really thorough review of a model that's been around a while. And we'd certainly very much welcome and encourage this community to take a look at those links and engage in that conversation, so that hopefully the tools that are available to use in the framework that EuropaBON builds up are fully shaped to the needs of this community.
Thanks, Tim. And I think this is also the philosophy really of EuropaBON. This should not be a new kid on the block, but rather a network of networks. And one of the things is also to see what tools are out there and how can this be built. I think the main thing is to work with the expertise and the tools which are there, and then see what is missing, or where do we need something which is maybe novel. So what is needed in order for integration. Obviously GBIF is a key player, and I think this is what Andreas Forzi, hello, also mentioned in your chat, that you say working with the national biodiversity networks which are existing already. So this is key, because these are networks which are already functioning. Not all countries do have actually national biodiversity networks and national infrastructures. So obviously a lot of the nodes in there are several GBIF nodes, obviously, which is great, but not all countries have this, and they may be different. So I think there will be a technical discussion to be had. How can we do this? How can we have a technical? But I think it's more a technical discussion. Main thing, I think the culture needs to be that we try to integrate, to align, to make it interoperable, and to find the ways how we can work together. And for some countries, it may need to be something new, or that they can adapt something from other member states. And the main challenge now is for now in the next 1.5 years to find workable solutions how we can all work together. So how we can work together with the distributed expertise and distributed infrastructures which we have, and what is best there. So thanks for raising this. And I think this is and therefore it needs to have this. We need to have this dialogue. What works best, so that we can use what is there already and enhance it, or bring it even to light. And then maybe also develop data flows for those policies, for example, where it isn't happening already, and where it's actually may be easy to do it, and where, hope I answered this, and thanks for raising this. Okay, over to Jutta Buschbaum.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Jutta Buschbaum from Northern Germany. I'm interested in post-2020 global monitoring. And I was wondering how the European processes fit into this global level. And I know there's the GeoBON Global Biodiversity Observation System. So I was wondering if there are already processes to integrate the different UN regions, like Asia Pacific, Africa, North America, Europe. So at that level, are there already ongoing cooperations and collaborations? Thank you.
Well, as you say, obviously EuropaBON is also part of GeoBON, so there is a close collection, but I think each region also needs to find their own working. Main thing is that in Europe, obviously we have already very good, or there are several very good policies, but they need to be underpinned by data so that they can actually be implemented. So I think we can obviously also, what I feel is, one thing is, for example, to learn from the Water Framework Directive, which has a really good monitoring. There is still room to improve, obviously, but then how this could be there, for example, we have a monitoring across Europe, and where we can then see this, how this could work for other policies, but also, for example, how biodiversity data can be used in order to inform the common agricultural policy, which has biodiversity targets, very clear biodiversity targets. Obviously, and I think here GBIF is obviously a big player. It is in order to make this interoperable also with other, because biodiversity obviously doesn't stop at only just in biodiversity in Europe, but to make this interoperable and alignable with other data sets which are international or global. So yeah, obviously that is one of the key things. EuropaBON won't be developed just on its own. But here, for example, we work with Biodiversity Plus and the different member states and the national biodiversity networks to find a solution which is workable and brings the policy results which are needed, so that we can really tackle those challenges. And you mentioned that post 2020 goals, obviously they need to be transported into the European goals and into the national goals, but this is obviously at the policy level. Yeah, so I do hope that this is that we can integrate this as well. It won't be our task to do this. This will be more at the policy level, but obviously we need to support policy with monitoring so that the policy will be implemented and also have effect and be accountable. Yeah.
So so I was thinking there are discussions of having global indicators, and I see that this is a lot is a policy question, but if you have global indicators, you need data that is harmonized globally. And so, yeah, so I was wondering if there are already exchanges to get data in a way that can be used globally. But yeah,
I think so. Yeah. So Dimitri obviously in the chat mentioned that there is a EuropaBON, which is already working globally together with GBIF. And then thanks also to Victor Martinez, that we obviously there are two European Space Agency projects which are developing satellite projects. These don't stop at national borders, definitely. But I do think that we also need a European solution so that the European Commission can actually implement the policies which we have. Because you're mentioning CBD, we have great policies. We had them for 2010, for 2020. Those targets, we've always missed them. And part of this because it wasn't accountable, because we didn't have the data to actually support this so that we can then say, did we reach those targets or not? So yeah, there will be international, obviously, alignment. Okay, I'm trying to monitor the, yeah.
And maybe just to complement what Aletta just said, we were also present at the last preparatory meeting of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in Geneva 2 months ago. And there, for example, we tried to advocate together with EuropaBON and others for these national biodiversity networks to be included in the text, in the actual text of the monitoring framework. Which obviously is not finalized yet, so we don't know if in the end they will be included or not. But I think, to my knowledge at least, there were no regional groupings within the monitoring discussions. There was no regional exchange, at least not to the extent I know. But you're certainly right. I mean, that's really important if we have global indicators.
Oh. And so this was a great success. So that obviously that we can work so closely with the CBD. And maybe this leads already over to the summary. Hannah, if you would like to synthesize some of this and also provide an outlook for the next steps, how we're going to work with all stakeholders, because we don't want to take more of your time. The webinar was 1 hour, but we tried to provide this in a more in regular intervals.
Yes,
with you.
For sure. So we're right on time. We hit 5 o'clock. I will show you very briefly in less than 1 minute what we plan to do next. Fantastic. I'm so sorry. Okay. Basically, what we're trying to do in our next steps is to continue integrating stakeholders at all levels of EuropaBON, and this is reflected in several of the upcoming events. The workshop on novel monitoring methods was mentioned several times. We're quite happy to say that it was so successful that we had to close the public registration for this event because we have too many participants, more than we can handle. If you still wish to participate, please send us an email and we can probably we can register you manually, but it's not possible to do that online anymore. We'll have a series of mini workshops on the policy showcases in June. In fall of this year and fall of next year, we will hold our annual stakeholder conference and policy experts meetings. All of this will be online. And we'll have a workshop on the actual co-design of a European biodiversity observation network in late 2022. We'll present this user and policy needs assessment at several international conferences, for example, the ECCB in Prague and the World Biodiversity Forum in Switzerland. We will continue collaborating very closely with the Commission, Biodiversa Plus, the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity, the Joint Research Centers, and many more. And moving on to the next centerpiece of what we're going to focus on is these terms of reference for a new biodiversity monitoring coordination center. You can imagine that this is a heavy lifting to design such a big, such a wide, a piece that has such wide effects on many people, on many sectors. We will do this in collaboration with many, many stakeholders, and you will get to hear, if you're interested, a first set of initial ideas, and you'll also be able to discuss them in the annual conference in fall 2022. We will announce the dates for this very soon. You have, by registering for this workshop, you have become a member of our member portal, one of about 700 or over 700 by now. So you will stay informed about everything that's going on within EuropaBON. And of course, we invite all of you, if you haven't done so yet, to read the full user and policy needs assessment if you're interested. And with that, we let you go. Enjoy your evenings. Thank you very much for participating, and we hope to see you in one of our next events.